there was no single piece of evidence that showed directly that Letby was guilty. There was, though, instead, significant circumstantial evidence that pointed the finger at her. Dr. Dewi Evans is a retired consultant paediatrician who was one of the 2 paediatric specialists brought in by the prosecution. Thank you very much for your time. Just your initial reaction to the sentencing. You know, you were an instrumental part of this case. Do you think that justice has been served? I'll just check we're OK with the camera. Dewi, can you hear me?
Sorry about that. Somebody tried to call me on my phone.
Not at all.
Let's start again.
I'm imagining lots of people want to be in touch with you. Just, do you feel as though justice has been served?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think this is horrific. It's probably the single most appalling event affecting any hospital in the NHS over the past 75 years. It is beyond belief what happened to these babies, and it is beyond belief why she got away with it for such a long time. Everyone who had a duty of care to these babies failed the babies and failed their families. I think my profession was a bit on the slow side to pick things up, but the responsibility most of all rests with NHS managers at Chester who failed to listen to the consultants despite their concerns after 3 months following the first event. Yeah.
Why do you think the profession was slow to pick it up?
The last thing you expect of your staff, that they're harming babies, they're harming their patients. So therefore, that was the main problem. The other problem is that managers have taken over far too much control over the care of patients. And as a result of that, doctors are loath to raise concerns because they're used to being ignored or dismissed, or even being told, as in this case, told to apologise to the perpetrator of this horrendous crime, which is what happened prior to Chester Police and myself becoming involved in 2017. Mm.
We know you were giving evidence for the prosecution. Can you we've got plenty of time, so how did you first become involved in the case, and why did you decide to say, actually, yes, this is something I'm going to be able to have an impact on?
I've been involved with medical legal work for over 30 years, and I've dealt with a number of cases alleging clinical negligence, not deliberate harm, involving babies over this time throughout the whole of England and Ireland. So I was quite experienced, and since 2013, I've been involved with a couple of dozen cases for police authorities via the National Crime Agency. So my name was well known to them, and I thought this was a case that I was suited to. I had the clinical experience because I've been involved with care of babies from my mid-20s throughout my professional career. And in addition, I was familiar with the medical legal system, so I thought this was my kind of case.
So when you started looking at what evidence there was being presented, what kind of conclusions were you coming to, and how quickly did you come to them?
Right, I got involved in May 2017, and what I told Chester Police was that if they suspected anyone, I did not want to know about this. In other words, I wanted to investigate the cause of the collapse or the cause of the death of these babies. I was not there to investigate a crime. And at that time, I was unaware of the name of Lucy Letby or anyone else. So I received a copy of the clinical notes of over 30 babies who'd either died or had collapsed between January 2015 and July 2016. And I looked at all of them. Some of these cases, you could understand why the babies that died. They died from the usual problems of small babies, hemorrhage, infection, some congenital problem, for instance. But I identified 15 babies whose collapse or death I could not explain as a natural cause. And in addition to that, their collapse not only was unexpected, but I felt that it was due to a condition we call air embolus. It was as if someone had injected air into their circulation directly. Other babies collapsed as a result, in my opinion, of someone injecting loads and loads of milk or milk and air directly into the stomach. And if you give loads and loads of milk into the stomach of a small baby, it interferes with their breathing because the diaphragm can't move up and down, and therefore they collapse. Other babies suffer direct trauma. They are found with blood around their mouth or blood at the back of the throat. So all of these babies' collapse could not be explained at all, other than someone had caused harm to them. And then later in 2018, I found 2 more cases. These were the second of twins, 2 separate lots of twins, who had low blood glucose values. Now, low blood glucose or low blood sugar is common in small babies, but a very astute medical officer in Chester had measured these babies' insulin level. And the insulin level was very, very high, which could not be explained on the basis of their producing their own insulin. So in addition to the other items of trauma, we now had 2 babies who had insulin injected into their systems. So this was an additional concern and not something that anyone had suspected initially. In fact, I owe it to Chester Police for being obsessive and methodical in their investigation, because I only saw the insulin poisoning cases because they were the second of twins who'd been harmed in other ways. And so this was a complete shock to me and a complete surprise. Yeah. But it was quite important, actually, because at last one could find some kind of smoking gun. In other words, one could now show that someone was causing harm to babies. Whereas with injection of air, unless someone sees you doing it, then you can't prove that anything. It would have been difficult to prove that these babies were placed in harm's way.
Yeah, it was your job, I guess, to explain what had happened to these babies, not by who, of course. That was then the job of the other parts of the prosecution.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, yes. And I should add that what I did was I sent the reports to Chester Police and said, look, we've got these 15, and then it became 17 cases, where I'm concerned about what's happened. And what I said was, you need to look at the duty roster for each of these events, because if you harm a small baby, that baby will deteriorate very quickly. It will deteriorate within seconds or minutes. So therefore, what you need to do is look at the duty rosters and find out which nurses and which doctors were on duty at that time. And it soon became apparent that there was, even after the first 4 babies, there was only one nurse who was on duty for all of the events, and that was Lucy Letby. And later it emerged that she was on duty for all 17 occasions when one or other of these babies collapsed and or died.
Yeah, we've talked already on this programme, and we'll continue to do so, about what processes were in place at the hospital, which meant maybe the alarm could have been raised far sooner. In terms of what you were looking at and investigating, do you think that the methods that she used to abuse or kill these babies were sophisticated enough that it meant it was quite difficult to identify what it was that meant these children had died?
Oh, she was an extremely clever criminal. She almost got away with it, and they may well deny it, but for the consultants actually pressing and demanding that the police got involved, I think she could well have got away with this, because I'm sorry to say this, but it's no surprise to me, although it's shocking to everyone else. The default position of NHS managers when things go wrong is the cover-up. And I think they tried quite hard to cover up her criminal activities. And I'm glad that they failed to get away with that.
Well, obviously, the hospital aren't here to defend themselves. There is a statement from the hospital which we can bring out. I just want to play you, actually, the statement from the police, which is suggesting that, because we know that there are going to be many other cases now examined by police to make sure that more didn't come to harm. Let's just have a quick listen.
She was very clinical and without remorse or empathy or thought process around what it was. And she continued to do exactly, how she'd gone through. She went through each case clinically. We would be foolish if we were to think that we have gathered all cases that Lucy Letby could have touched in one go. We're committed to doing a overarching investigation looking at every single baby's admission into a neonatal unit for the entire footprint that Lucy Letby's been employed, which is over 4,000 babies across both the Liverpool Women's Hospital and the Countess of Chester. I'm not saying that there are collapses and deaths subject of the investigation, but there are babies that have died within the hospitals that we are within that period having reviewed. There are some cases that have been initially highlighted to us at the moment as concerning from an independent review, and then those parents have been informed about where we are with that investigation and are being supported.
Dewi, just listening to that, because of how sophisticated her methodology was, how hard is it going to be to actually, in any case that is even remotely suspicious, identify whether an investigation is going to be needed?
Well, the investigation is ongoing. I'm not involved with the subsequent investigation. I've drawn a line under my medical legal practice following this case. I've been involved with paediatrics for 50 years, so I think it's time to stop. Once you start thinking about what happened, then I don't think it's that difficult. I hope this does not sound blasé, but the first baby I saw who collapsed unexpectedly, and this is back in November 2017 when I filed my first report, I thought, oh my God, this baby has collapsed as a result of a circulation of air injected directly into the veins. And that was baby A in this trial, and his twin suffered the same fate, although the twin survived. And really, it's a matter of excluding the usual cause of collapse in babies, such as infection or hemorrhage or some kind of peculiar congenital problem. One could easily exclude those. But in addition to this, one also found, in addition to this, the only explanation was the injection of air into the circulation. And then, having prepared my preliminary report on the first few babies, more evidence came of some peculiar discoloration that these babies had suffered, which has been associated with air embolus in other cases. And this reinforced my initial opinion and, of course, reinforced the diagnosis. The diagnosis of milk being injected into the stomach was far easier. Baby G was a baby who was on 45 ml of milk every 3 hours, which is not a large volume of milk. And when the nurse looking after this baby went for her break, Lucy Letby came in and must have given this poor baby a huge amount of milk, all milk and air, down a syringe. This led to the stomach blowing up, becoming enlarged. This interfered with the breathing and the baby collapsed. And the baby vomited across the whole of the nursery. And as well as vomiting all over the nursery, the nurse still aspirated 45 ml from the stomach. So you can't vomit all over a nursery when you've only been fed 45 ml and there is still 45 ml still left there. But it was clear that this baby had been injected with milk or milk and air, and that occurred in other babies as well. And some babies suffered having milk or milk and air injected into the stomach, as well as being killed by an injection of air into the venous circulation.
Yeah. If you've just joined us, I appreciate we are talking about some extremely distressing details. The case of Lucy Letby, the nurse who's been found guilty of murdering 7 babies, attempting to murder 6 babies. Joining us on the programme is Dr. Dewi Evans, who was giving evidence for the prosecution, medical evidence. The final thing I want to ask you, Dewi, is just when you were looking at the information presented to you and in how you were compiling your reports, you're speaking with real conviction about what you believe was the cause of death in these babies. Was there moments where you thought, is this cast iron? Any moments of doubt for you?
I think you need to keep it simple if you're a clinician. And I couldn't think of another cause, quite frankly. I was aware that the police, because the police were involved, that some criminal activity was suspected, obviously, and I had to block that thought out, which is why I told the police not to name any suspect, even if they had a suspect. And so, to use the jargon, I approached it in a very clinical way. I only had access to the notes. The notes were electronic copies prepared by Chester NHS and given to the police. Many of the notes were organised disgracefully, not in date order. Things were upside down. I had to print out a lot of them simply to make sense out of them, so that both the police and I had to put up with, shabby support from NHS management. But each case, I looked at each case individually, and I think for certainly the 7 murder convictions and the convictions for attempted murder, each case, in my opinion, was a standalone case. In other words, if it was the only case, I think there was sufficient to explore and investigate it from a criminal point of view and possibly charge someone. Although if there were only 1 or 2 cases, of course, it would be more difficult to prove who was responsible for the assault.
Yeah, and the jury did convict her of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Dewi Evans, consultant paediatrician who was advising an independent medical witness for the prosecution. Really appreciate your time.